me, Cedric, Teray, Pascal are in a group chat, and they never share news from California. These Negroes have been sharing this reparations news like they're watching the goddamn OJ trial.
Right. More exciting than the white Bronco.
when Gavin Newsom brings that check down, Cedric finna be like Sister Act 2. Oh, happy day. Back to the more serious matters. Cedric, in your book, you say anti-policing struggles must ultimately transcend the innate liberalism and ethnic politics of Black Lives Matter, which are political dead ends too easily usurped by the investor class and mainstream party politics, and instead directly address the underlying capitalist class contradictions that are driving police killing and America's overgrown carceral apparatus. Mm-hmm. The book, The New Jim Crow, as well as the 13th documentary frame and the 13th Amendment, also in the 13th documentary framework, have become commonplace in any discussion around the carceral system. Mm-hmm. A book that we have both referenced, Locking Up Our Own, tells a more detailed story without the fiery image of neo-slavery. Mm-hmm. What does The New Jim Crow and the powerful 13th documentary miss in their analysis of the carceral state?
Well, let me say something before I do that, which is, and I'm sure, you can recall this as well, right? During the late Reagan-Bush period, right? The first response we get, the first analysis of the carceral expansion comes from Black civil rights organizations, right? And there's a lot of different reasons for that, right? Part of it has to do with where some of the most well-publicized incidences of police violence are coming from, right? So if you think about Eleanor Bunkford in New York City or Malice Green in Detroit, right? When those people are killed in ways that we see as being unfair by police, the immediate groups that respond, or civil rights organizations, local activists, clergy, and what they do is they do what they've been doing, right? They simply frame those murders as an extension of the Jim Crow system that we thought we had left behind, right? They use that language when they're talking about it. And it's a powerful language, right? I mean, I was a teenager during the 1980s. And if you asked me back then how I explained, all of those incidents, I would say this is racism, right? Because I didn't have any other reference points. I didn't live in white neighborhoods or communities. And so I would respond the same ways. You also had hip hop music at that time, which amplified that sort of race analysis of what was happening. Mm-hmm. And what we should know by now, if we take a longer view, right? I mean, there were whites who were being killed by police back then as well, but they didn't have the same advocacy networks or apparatus in place to deal with those sorts of police killings. And so it took a lot longer for us to catch up, I think. And in a way, we still haven't caught up, right? We're still using the same frames, even though the reality looks very different, right? So what New Jim Crow gets wrong, what Black Lives Matter gets wrong, is that once we leave the urban theater, the numbers change, right? Blacks are, in any given year, a minority of those persons who are killed by police, right? And so it begs other questions. Why are people in general being killed by police? What are these different civilian police conflicts like? And it also misses who the victims are if we're just talking about Black people, right? Because they're not the same, right? We're not talking about members of the Black middle class by and large. We're not necessarily talking about Black wealthy people, but we're essentially discussing the most vulnerable elements of the Black working class who are being routinely targeted by police for harassment and in many cases involved in fatal conflicts with police. So I think that's what's missing, right? It doesn't even the Black predicament, right? If we're talking Jim Crow or Black Lives Matter rhetoric, right? It essentially gives us the sense that any one of us can be stopped, harassed, and killed by police in any given moment. And that's just not the truth. That's just not the case, right? I mean, think about the some of the most high profile cases, right? George Floyd. Let's take George Floyd, Eric Garner, who you've already evoked, Alton Sterling, and Freddie Gray as some examples, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we look at these people as individuals, who were they? What were their lives like, right? They weren't bankers. They weren't college graduates who were working as part of the professional managerial stratum. They were people who were struggling to try to eke out an existence in the economy that doesn't necessarily meet the needs of people who are less educated, who are lower skilled, and who would have been absorbed in an earlier period of, high level manufacturing production in the country, but are not anymore, right? So, what was George Floyd doing in Minneapolis, right? He had moved there as part of a ministry that was about relocating men who were in recovery to help them put their lives back together and find gainful employment. And he had done a lot of different kinds of jobs, right? He'd worked as a security guard. I don't even know if I should say this, but he had also been involved in, he'd been a rapper for a little while. He'd also been involved in a little bit of sex work. And so there's different things that happened and that he did.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying that not to impugn him, but just to situate him as a person, right? Who
Right.
is like millions of other people who are trying to eke out an existence. Eric Garner, same thing, selling Lucy's in front of a convenience store, a bodega in Long Island, right? Um, Alton Sterling selling pirated CDs or used CDs in front of a gas station in Baton Rouge, and Freddie Gray, like a lot of people, was involved in regular drug dealing, which again, not trying to impugn him at all. It's actually a really pretty grotesque aspect of our society where I've got 3 cannabis dispensaries within walking distance of my house here,
Mm-hmm.
but people in my home state of Louisiana are still being arrested for cannabis possession and distribution. I mean, that's just a gross injustice. But again, I think we need to focus on who these Black people are who are being targeted on a regular basis. I mean, I've been stopped by police many times before. I've been harassed before. I've been handcuffed. So I've had those experiences, but it doesn't happen to me on a regular or weekly basis, as it does with many
Mm-hmm.
working class and largely unemployed and underemployed Black country. So
How do
long
you?
response to what you're saying.
No, we like long responses. That
Right,
was
right.
awesome. Very thorough. How do you feel about the example of racism given by some, particularly Black men with money, who talk about being pulled over in the fancy car in certain neighborhoods?
Yeah, I mean, I think it happens, right? And I'm saying this because I'll just give a vague reference to it. In the last month, I've dealt directly with 2 young men who I'm connected to, my
Mm-hmm.
own son, but also the son of a longtime friend of mine who've had run-ins with police, right? And without going into all the details, it can happen to people who are upwardly mobile. It can happen to people who are in, have a different class position. I think the way to explain that, and Touré is great with this, right? He actually says that the Black middle class tends to be collateral damage, essentially, in a strategy that's mainly trained working class and underemployed and unemployed people, right? It's not necessarily something that
Mm.
we're going to confront and face every day. And this is another part that James Foreman Jr. brings into focus. Once either of us gets caught up in it, right? Those of us who have means, we can hire a lawyer, right? We can figure out
Right.
ways to work in the system to reduce the consequences of an arrest, even if we're guilty, right? If it's a DUI, if it is possession of
You can
of
pay for a
different
DUI.
amounts of drugs,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's very different. Yeah.
right. You're in a different situation than somebody who comes in unable to pay for basic fines and fees that the court may level against them, let alone be able to hire their own private lawyers. So when I hear people make those cases, and the one that folks always used to like to use was Skip Gates, right, being harassed in Cambridge.
Mm-hmm.
Skip Gates is not going to he's not going to, right? He's not going to go to jail for overnight. He's not going to go to prison for life because he has the resources and the notoriety and the social networks and the power to avoid, being processed by the system in that particular way. I mean, what happens? People always lop off the consequence of it, right? Skip Gates gets into a conflict with the police. He doesn't get shot. He ends up having a beer conference with the president, right? As a result of it. So it's just
Right.
it's not a good example to use. But it doesn't stop people from using it, right? From sort of using this as a way of bringing us back to a conversation about this being primarily about race and racism.
Well, they say it's just